Hello and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents Starfinder Basics of Starships Part 5, Gunners and Damage. In this video we will examine the role of gunners aboard a starship, as well as how starship attacks are made and how critical damage effects are applied. Attacks are performed during the gunnery phase of starship combat and are resolved by rolling a gunnery check. Gunnery checks are similar to attacks in personal combat, but the bonus calculation is a little different. When making a gunnery check, the player rolls 1d20 and adds either their base attack bonus or the number of ranks they have in the piloting skill, whichever is higher, plus their dexterity modifier, and then is modified by any range penalties. That base bonus can be further modified by some captain and science officer actions and also by computers. Starship weapons are listed as having one of three ranges: short, medium, and long. Short-range weapons have a range increment of 5 hexes, medium-range weapons have a range increment of 10 hexes, and long-range weapons have a range increment of 20 hexes. These are the same range increments as you will find with sensors. As with personal combat, attacks on starship scale that are within that weapon's first range increment suffer no penalty, but attacking a target beyond the weapon's first range increment imposes a cumulative -2 penalty for every range increment of distance beyond the first, and the maximum range for any weapon is 10 times its range increment. The space around a ship is divided into 4 firing arcs. Each weapon may only target enemies in its defined arc, except for turrets which may fire into any of the 4 arcs. If an enemy ship is in a hex that overlaps 2 of the arcs, then the attackers choose which arc the target is in. This does not mean that the target is in 2 arcs simultaneously. For example, if an enemy ship occupies a hex that is in both the forward arc and the starboard arc, the attackers decide if they want to treat that enemy as if it is in the forward arc and may be targeted by forward weapons, or if it is in the starboard arc and may be targeted by starboard weapons. In other words, the enemy ship in this example cannot be targeted by both the forward and starboard weapons this round. The attackers need to choose one or the other. Starship weapons also fall into one of 2 broad categories: direct fire and tracking weapons. Gunnery checks for direct fire weapons are contested by the target's armor class, and tracking weapons like missiles and torpedoes are contested by the enemy's target lock. A ship's armor class is equal to 10 plus the pilot's ranks in the piloting skill, not their total piloting skill bonus, but the number of ranks in the piloting skill, plus a modifier for the ship's size, plus the ship's armor bonus. And this can be further modified by piloting stunts and other actions. And a ship's armor bonus is equal to that ship's armor mark rating. So Mark 3 armor adds +3 to the ship's armor class. And armor that is Mark 5 or higher also imposes a penalty to target lock. And Mark 9 armor and heavier also increases the ship's turn distance that is listed under their maneuverability score. The more armor plating you apply to a ship, the slower and less maneuverable it's going to be. Target lock is calculated the same as armor class, except instead of adding a bonus for the ship's armor, you instead add a bonus for the ship's defensive countermeasures. As mentioned before, target lock is used to contest attacks made with tracking weapons like missiles, whereas direct fire attacks are resolved immediately. Tracking weapons may persist beyond the round in which they are fired. Tracking weapons are listed in the Starship Weapons table with a listed speed, and they function the same as starships with perfect maneuverability. When such a projectile is fired, a gunnery check is rolled against target lock as usual. If the result of that check is a failure, then the projectile misses and spirals harmlessly away. But if the gunnery check is a success, then that projectile moves a number of hexes equal to its speed towards the target. If the projectile does not reach the target in that round, it persists into the next round and another gunnery check is made. This and future gunnery checks for that weapon do not receive any bonuses thanks to computers, captains, or science officers active in the round that it was fired, or during the current round. But it may suffer penalties imposed by other ships, such as an enemy science officer using improved countermeasures. Again, if the check fails, then that projectile is lost, and if it is a success, then it continues to move towards the target at its listed speed and with perfect maneuverability. This continues round after round until either the gunnery check results in a miss or the projectile moves into the same hex as the target, at which time it detonates. As mentioned briefly in our previous videos, when a pilot moves their ship through a hex that is occupied by an enemy ship, that enemy is allowed to make a free attack against them. This can be viewed as a sort of space opportunity attack, although it's never officially referred to as such. And here's how it works. When an enemy ship moves through your hex, one gunner aboard the ship may make a free attack with any one direct fire weapon, so it cannot be a tracking weapon, must be a direct fire weapon aimed against the enemy's aft arc. This attack is not rolled until the gunnery phase as usual, and its gunnery check may not receive any benefits from roll actions performed aboard the ship, such as divert power or lock-on weapons. Note that only members of the gunner role may take this free action, so if you are in a single-seat starfighter, and probably therefore assuming the pilot role, you may not take this free attack. Also note that this free attack not only does not require you to spend an action in order to perform, but the weapon that you use can then be used again in the gunnery phase as normal. This is a very rare exception to the rule that states that weapons normally may only be used once per round. Just like with personal scale combat, when a gunnery check meets or exceeds the armor class or target lock is contested by, the targeted ship is hit. But there are two key differences to be aware of when applying the damage that results from a starship attack. First, damage is not immediately applied. Refer back to part 2 of this series for full details, but in short, the gunnery phase of starship combat is divided into two distinct segments. In the first half of the phase, every ship declares their attacks and rolls their gunnery checks. But if they hit and damage is rolled, that damage is not applied to their target until the second half of the phase. In other words, if the player's ship attacks first, rolls a hit and enough damage to destroy their enemy, that enemy still gets to make an attack of its own before that happens, because the damage is not applied until after all attacks are made. And the second key difference with Starship Damage is how Starship Damage is applied in layers. First, the damage is reduced by the number of shield points defending the arc of the targeted ship. This is somewhat similar to how stamina points absorb damage in personal combat first. If the amount of damage exceeds the number of shield points, then the remaining damage total is compared against the target ship's damage threshold. And this is where the difference with personal scale combat lies. Refer back to part 1 of this series for more information about damage thresholds, but the key to remember is the damage threshold is a minimum number. If the amount of damage after shields is less than or equal to the damage threshold, then no further damage is applied from the attack. And if the damage after shields exceeds the damage threshold, then all of that damage is applied to the targeted ship's hull points. Damage threshold does not function like damage reduction does in personal scale combat. You do not subtract the damage threshold from the damage total to be applied to the ship's hull points. And only starships size huge and larger may have damage thresholds, so this step may be skipped if the target ship is size large or smaller. When a ship is reduced to 0 hull points, it is not destroyed, but instead is disabled and continues to float in the direction it was traveling at a rate of half of its speed until it is repaired, rescued, or destroyed. At this point, the ship is still minimally operational and its crew is not in immediate danger unless its life support systems have been destroyed. Starships continue suffering damage after being reduced to 0 hull points, and if a ship ever suffers total damage exceeding double its maximum hull points, or another way to look at it is if the ship is reduced to a negative amount of hull points equal to its maximum hull value, then it is completely destroyed. For example, when a Cavalry Venture is reduced to 0 hull points, it becomes disabled. It cannot function during combat and continues drifting helplessly in the direction that it was traveling at half normal speed. The crew is not in immediate danger of dying unless the ship's life support systems are wrecked, but if the ship continues being attacked, that damage from those attacks is still tracked. If the Venture is reduced to negative 55, 55 being that ship's maximum hull point value, then it is completely destroyed. When this happens, the ship is beyond the ability to repair, the hull is compromised, and the crew will need some form of armor or environmental protection to survive. These are the rules, but just like with personal combat, GMs may choose to simplify encounters by saying enemy ships are destroyed when they are reduced to 0 hull points. Repairing damage will be discussed in the next video of this series, which is all about the engineering role. That's how damage works in Starship combat, but we also need to discuss how critical hits and critical damage work. The first thing to know about critical hits in Starship combat is they do not deal double damage. Instead, they inflict their normal damage, and in addition to that, a critical damage effect is applied to one of the enemy ship's systems. Critical damage can be applied in one of two ways. First, it is scored when a gunnery check rolls a natural 20 and damage is dealt to the target's hull. If all of the damage is absorbed by the target's shield points, then no critical damage effect occurs. Likewise, if the damage does not exceed the target's damage threshold, then there is no critical damage. Even if a natural 20 is rolled, the damage from the attack must lower the target's hull points by at least 1 in order for critical damage to occur. And second, a critical damage effect is applied whenever the target's hull points drop below its critical threshold value or a multiple of that value. If you are not familiar with how critical thresholds work, or you just need a little refresher, then I highly recommend you pause this video now and go watch part 1 of this series where we discuss all of those rules. Also note that critical damage applies whenever either of the two conditions are met. Therefore, if a gunnery check results in a natural 20 and its damage pushes the target past its critical threshold value or a multiple of that value, then 2 critical damage effects are going to be applied to the target for that one attack. When critical damage is scored, the attacker rolls 1d100 and compares the result to the table found on page 321 of the core rules. This roll determines which of the enemy systems was hit, and also describes which of the ship's actions are affected. Damage to life support penalizes all of the captain's actions. Damage to sensors affect science officer actions, including skill checks to balance the shields. When a weapons array is damaged, one of the ship's 4 firing arcs is randomly selected by rolling 1d4, and the critical damage effect applies to all gunnery checks made with weapons firing in that arc, including turrets. If the selected firing arc has no weapons in it and the ship has no turrets, then re-roll and select another arc. Again, it is the firing arc that is damaged, not necessarily the weapons themselves. So if the port side arc has been dealt 2 critical damage effects, and the aft arc has suffered only 1, then turrets will suffer 2 crits worth of penalties when they fire from the port arc, and only one critical damage effect when that same turret fires from the aft arc. If that seems counterintuitive, just remember that there is more to a weapon system than the weapon itself. For example, it could be the port side targeting array that suffered the extra damage and not the turret itself. Critical damage that is applied to the engines penalize the pilot's actions, and damaged power cores penalize all engineering actions except for hold it together and patch, which we will discuss in our next video that is all about the engineering role. Each time critical damage is applied to a system, that system is pushed one step down its critical damage track. The critical damage track is as follows: undamaged, to glitching, to malfunctioning, to wrecked. So the first time a system suffers critical damage, it gains the glitching condition. If it suffers another critical damage effect while it is glitching, it gains the malfunctioning condition. And one more critical hit pushes it to wrecked. When a system is glitching, it has a -2 penalty on all relevant skill checks. For example, if the sensors are glitching, then all of the science officer checks, including those to balance shields, suffer a -2 penalty. If the power core is glitching, all engineering checks suffer a -2 penalty except for hold it together and patch. If a glitching system is hit with a critical damage effect again, it becomes malfunctioning. When this happens, all associated skill checks worsen from a -2 penalty to a -4 penalty. Also, no push actions may be attempted when the associated system is malfunctioning. For example, a science officer cannot use the target system or lock-on actions while their sensors are malfunctioning, but could continue to use balance, scan, or improve countermeasures because those are not push actions. Also, a malfunctioning power core applies another -2 penalty to all other systems aboard the ship. For example, if sensors are glitching and weapons are undamaged, but the power core is pushed down to malfunctioning, then all engineering checks, except for hold it together and patch, suffer a -4 penalty, and all science officer checks also suffer a -4 penalty, -2 for being glitching, and another -2 for a malfunctioning power core, and all gunnery checks suffer a -2 penalty for the damaged power core. The sensors are still considered as glitching, and the weapons are still considered as undamaged for all other respects, and may continue to perform push actions, but suffer a -2 penalty from the power core when doing so. If a malfunctioning system suffers critical damage again, it becomes wrecked. When a system is wrecked, all crew actions associated with that system automatically fail, and when the power core becomes wrecked, all other systems suffer a -4 penalty to their actions. Be aware that wrecked does not mean destroyed. The system is not able to perform under the stress of combat situations, but may continue to minimally work outside of combat. For example, if not in combat, wrecked engines might be enough for that ship to limp its way back to a nearby port and get repairs. When rolling on the chart to determine the system hit with critical damage, if the result is a system that is already wrecked, you skip down the chart to the next system. For example, if a 42 is rolled and all weapons in all arcs are wrecked, you do not roll again. Instead, you move down and apply critical damage to the engines. And if the power core suffers critical damage while wrecked, you do not move back to the top of the chart and apply that damage to life support. Instead, when a wrecked power core suffers more critical damage, then a crew member aboard that ship is wounded. When this happens, roll to randomly determine which crew member is subject to the hit, and that character suffers personal scale damage equal to the Starship Damage result. For example, if the Starship was critically hit by a weapon that deals 7 points of Starship scale damage after shields to the hull, then the randomly selected crew member suffers 7 points of damage to their stamina or to their hit points if they have no stamina left. You do not adjust the damage for firing a Starship scale weapon at a character. Also note that the affected crew member may attempt a DC 20 reflex save to only take half the damage, and by the rules as they are written, only crew members are subject to this damage, not passengers. I believe the assumption here is that passengers have secured themselves in a safer place aboard the ship during combat, and only the crew who are actively fighting are exposed to this kind of damage. With the foundation laid for how attacks and critical damage work in Starship combat, let's now discuss the gunner role and what actions they can perform. Unsurprisingly, gunners act during the gunnery phase of combat, and as we learned in part 2 of this series, the gunnery phase is divided into 2 segments. In the first segment, attacks are declared in reverse initiative order, and in the second segment, the results of those attacks are resolved and applied in normal initiative order. The most basic action used by gunners is simply called shoot. When taking a shoot action, the gunner makes a gunnery check with any one weapon targeting an enemy in that weapon's arc. The next action is called fire at will. This is a push action that allows the gunner to fire any 2 weapons one time each. Both the attacks are made with a -4 penalty, and the weapons used do not have to be in the same arc or even be of the same type. The gunner could attack with a portside direct fire weapon at one target and fire a tracking weapon from a turret that is pointing out the starboard arc at a different ship. And fire at will does not change a weapon's fire rate. Most weapons may only be fired once per round, so the weapons used by this action are consumed for that round and may not be also fired by another gunner in that same round. The third gunnery action is called broadside. This is another push action and requires the gunner to be at least level 6 and to spend 1 resolve point. When using the broadside action, a gunner may aim and fire all available weapons in a single arc, including the ship's turret weapons. Each weapon may target any vessel in that arc, but all attacks suffer a -2 penalty. And again, except in rare circumstances, no single weapon may be fired more than once per round, so if a turret is used as part of a broadside attack, then another gunner aboard the ship cannot then spin that turret around into another arc and fire it on their turn. And the last action available to gunners is called precise targeting. This is again a push action that costs 1 resolve point to use, and the gunner must be at least 12th level to attempt it. When using precise targeting, the gunner may fire 1 starship weapon at 1 target just like when they use the shoot action, but if this attack hits and the shields in that arc are completely depleted before the attack, then critical damage is automatically scored against a randomly selected system. This is in addition to any other critical effects applied. So for example, if a gunner used precise targeting against the arc of an enemy ship that has no shield points in it, and the gunnery check is a natural 20, and the damage pushes the enemy ship past its critical threshold, then 3 separate critical damage effects would be applied with the affected system selected randomly each time, all from this one attack. In this video, we explored the gunnery role of Starship combat. We began by discussing how attacks work in Starship combat. Instead of attack rolls, gunners fire their weapons by making gunnery checks. The bonus they receive for gunnery checks is equal to either their base attack bonus or the number of ranks they have in the piloting skill, whichever is higher, plus their dexterity modifier. This is further modified by other effects like range penalties. Range penalties in Starship combat are similar to the range penalties found in personal scale combat. Each weapon has a range increment and suffer a cumulative -2 penalty for every range increment of distance to the target after the first. Maximum range is 10 range increments. Each weapon may target enemies in a defined firing arc. Each ship has 4 firing arcs that mirror the ship's 4 shield facings. Turrets may fire into any of the 4 arcs. Ship weapons fall into one of 2 categories: direct fire and tracking. Direct fire weapons are contested by the target's armor class, and tracking weapons are contested by the enemy's target lock score. Armor class is equal to 10 plus the pilot's number of ranks in the piloting skill plus the ship's armor bonus, and is then further modified by the ship's size. Target lock is calculated the same way, except instead of armor, target lock benefits from the ship's defensive countermeasures. In addition to being resisted by a ship's target lock score, tracking weapons differ from direct fire weapons in that they may persist beyond the round in which they are fired. Every combat round, the gunnery check is rolled again for tracking weapons, and as long as that check succeeds, the projectile moves at its speed towards its target with perfect maneuverability. If the gunnery check for a tracking weapon ever fails, then that projectile is lost. When a ship passes through a hex occupied by an enemy ship, one gunner aboard that enemy ship may make a free attack against them using any direct fire weapon against the aft arc of the ship passing through their space. This is a free attack, does not cost any actions, and also the weapon that is used to perform this free attack may be used again as normal during the gunnery phase. Damage in Starship combat is applied in layers. First, damage is reduced by the number of shield points in the targeted arc. Any excess is then compared to the enemy ship's damage threshold score. If damage after shields is equal to or less than the damage threshold, then no damage is applied to the target's hull. If damage after shields exceeds the damage threshold, then that full amount is subtracted from the target ship's hull points. When a ship is reduced to 0 hull points, it is disabled and continues to float at half its speed in the direction it was moving when it was hit. A ship is destroyed once it suffers a total amount of hull damage equal to twice its maximum hull point value. Critical hits occur in one of 2 ways. The first is when a natural 20 is rolled on a gunnery check and the target's hull points are reduced by at least 1 point of damage. And the second is when the target's hull points are dropped below its critical threshold or a multiple of its critical threshold value. See part 1 of this series for a full explanation of how that works. The first thing to remember about critical hits in Starship combat is that they do not inflict double damage. Instead, they deal normal damage plus 1 critical damage effect. Critical damage is applied to one of the ship's 5 key systems, which is selected randomly. Every time a system suffers a critical damage effect, it is pushed 1 step down the critical damage track from undamaged to glitching to malfunctioning and then to wrecked. Each critical damage condition imposes a penalty to all actions made by the roll associated with that system. Damaged power cores impose a penalty to all actions in combat, not just the engineering roll. When randomly selecting the system to receive a critical damage effect, if the selected system is already wrecked, you move down the table to the next system. If the power core is selected and it is already wrecked, then one member of the ship's crew suffers personal scale damage equal to the amount of hull damage the attack caused. Gunners act during the gunnery phase of Starship combat. Their most basic action is called shoot, which allows the gunner to attack with one of the ship's weapons normally. Fire at will allows the gunner to attack with two weapons, but each suffer a -4 penalty. Broadside lets the gunner fire all weapons in a single arc, including turrets, each with a -2 penalty. And remember, except in rare cases, no weapon may fire more than once per round, regardless of how many gunners the ship has. And the last action available to gunners is precise targeting. When using precise targeting, if the gunner hits an enemy arc that had 0 shield points before the gunner declared the attack, then a critical damage effect is automatically applied to a randomly selected system. With that, we'll bring this video to a close. If you found this video helpful, please give us a like, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and bell so you don't miss out on our future videos. Leave us a comment letting us know what topics you would like to see us cover in the future, and we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. If you would like to use some of the maps that we feature in our videos with your own games, you can find them at Maps of Mastery and 0 Hour. Links to those sites may be found in the description. Thanks for watching, take care, and we'll see you soon with more basics for your favorite tabletop games.